Hey guys, tonight we're going deep into something that's equal parts terrifying and fascinating. The kind of topic that makes you glad for your thermostat and that soft-weighted blanket. Tonight, we're heading into the bone-deep cold of the American Wild West, where winters weren't just inconvenient, they were lethal. You're on the plains. It's the 1860s. There's no Uber, no electricity, and spoiler alert, you probably won't survive this. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Oh, and tell me where you're watching from and what time it is. I want to know who's listening to this in their flannel pyjamas at 3 a.m. And now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You arrive just as winter breathes down its first frosty breath across the wide open frontier. You hear it before you see it. That eerie silence before a storm, like the prairies holding its breath. Then, there it is, a thick rolling bank of white cloud low on the horizon. It's not fluffy snowman snow, this is ice shard snow, the kind that pelts sideways into your face at 40 miles per hour, powered by a wind that feels like it hates you personally. Your boots crunch across half-frozen mud as you fumble to pull your coat tighter. But it's not a coat, really. It's a threadbare wool blanket you've wrapped around yourself and tied with rope. Your breath fogs in the air and freezes in your moustache if you've got one. Welcome to December in Wyoming territory. There's no official warning system, the sky doesn't blink orange alerts, but the old-timers, they read the way horses twitch, the way the wind changes direction, how fast the birds vanish. That's all the warning you get. You don't wait for the snow, you bolt for shelter if you have any. A lot of folks don't. Now picture this, you're in a homestead shack, if you're lucky. It's a crude rectangle of logs, or more primitively, a dugout burrowed into a hillside. The walls are packed with mud, maybe some straw. The doors are canvas flap nailed over a wooden frame. You pray it stays closed when the wind howls. Inside, it's darker than you'd like and colder than you'd expect. The single window, just a hole covered in oiled paper, is fogged up and rimmed with ice. The air smells like smoke and old sweat and whatever animal fat you've been burning for light. You huddle near the fire, assuming you've managed to get one going with the tiny pile of twigs and kindling you've been hoarding like treasure. Outside, snow falls so fast and thick it erases the horizon. You could step 5 feet away and lose all sense of direction. In towns, people have died just walking from their house to the barn, found later frozen mid-step. You hear it, even from inside, the wind. It moans, not metaphorically, it literally moans, like a trapped spirit dragging itself through the cracks of your cabin walls. This sound is with you for days. It gets into your dreams. And the temperature, try -30. Fahrenheit. That's without the wind chill. Here's a wild historical truth. In many places across the West, settlers recorded more deaths from cold exposure than from attacks or disease. Starvation came close, but cold was the real serial killer. Entire families huddled together under one buffalo hide, praying to see morning. And not everyone did. Your neighbours might be half a day's ride away, impossible in this weather. So if something goes wrong, say your roof caves in or someone gets frostbite so bad it turns black and necrotic, you're on your own. The nearest doctor might be 2 towns away, and even then he's probably snowed in too. That's the kind of winter isolation that makes even the most hardened cowboy feel like a child again. Meanwhile, your livestock, the same ones you rely on for milk, meat or warmth, are suffering too. Horses and cattle freeze standing up, their eyelashes coated in ice, their breath forming stalactites on the barn rafters. You bring the chickens inside, maybe even a goat or 2. You don't have the luxury of hygiene right now. Body heat is currency. If that means sleeping nose to snout with a smelly old mule, so be it. Here's a strange but true fringe fact. Some settlers used to bank their homes with literal blocks of snow. They'd pack the outer walls with frozen drifts to act as insulation. That's right, snow to keep the cold out. Counterintuitive, but if you've ever heard of igloos, you know cold can trap warmth when you build smart. Still, the psychological toll, real. Modern psychologists now believe that frontier winters caused low-level seasonal depression across entire communities. What we'd now label as SAD, seasonal affective disorder. Only back then no one called it anything. They just got quiet, angry, numb, maybe a little too into their whiskey stash. Speaking of which, here's where we hit our first great scholarly debate. A lot of people believe alcohol was the ultimate winter cure-all back then. Settlers drank to warm up, to sleep, to forget the cold. But modern science says alcohol actually lowers your body temperature. It dilates blood vessels, making you feel warmer while you're slowly freezing. So was it survival or slow suicide with a side of storytelling? The truth's probably somewhere in the slushy middle. Your first Wild West winter isn't about thriving, it's about not dying. There's no such thing as comfortable, only less miserable. And if you make it to spring with all your fingers and toes still attached, you've officially levelled up. The truth is, you've barely dipped your toes into this frozen hellscape. The worst is still coming. But hey, you've got your buffalo robe, a good pair of wool socks, and a fire that might hold. Now that you've just barely survived your first night in a prairie blizzard, let's talk about the next obvious question. How exactly are you supposed to dress for this nightmare? Spoiler, it's not cute. There are no sleek parkas or fleece-lined boots. In fact, you're wearing what can only be described as a collection of scraps stitched and layered together with the same level of strategy a child uses to make a snowman. You start with underclothes, if you're lucky enough to have them. Scratchy wool long johns, often patched in the worst places, and so stiff they could stand on their own. Then come the trousers, heavy cotton, or, if you're really doing well, leather. Over that, maybe a second pair. Layers are less about fashion and more about survival. Every extra thread is a shield between your fragile body and the endless ice wind. Your shirt's made of flannel or muslin, worn thin from too many washes or no washes at all. A vest goes over that. Not because it's warm, but because that's where you keep your flint, pocket knife, and maybe a crust of jerky. Then you add a coat, if it can be called that. In the early days, coats were often just heavy wool blankets, pinned at the chest or sewn up at the sides. You might look like a lumpy walking tent, but at least you're warmish. And here's where things get interesting. Some people used paper as insulation. Yes, literal paper. Newspaper if you had it, or old ledgers and catalogue pages, stuffed between layers of clothing to trap body heat. It crinkles when you move, like you're gift-wrapped, but desperate times call for absurd measures. Now for your feet. You'd think boots would do the trick, and sure, leather boots are a step up, pun fully intended. But leather cracks in the cold, it freezes. You might walk out in boots and come back in wooden clogs, so most folks stuffed them with whatever they could find, hay, cloth, even moss, keep toes from turning purple. Wool socks were gold, 2 pairs. You were living large, and yes, animal skins, skunk pelts, wolf hides, raccoon, you name it. If it had fur, someone turned it into a lining, a hat, or some kind of crude mitten. You wear it all at once. You're a walking taxidermy project, barely mobile but vaguely warm. Hats were usually fur with long flaps to tie under the chin, or sometimes just a second, smaller coat tied around your head like a horrifying turban. Gloves? Rare. Mittens were more common, easier to make, often sewn from deer hide and lined with rabbit fur. Or in a real pinch, you just wrap your hands in strips of cloth and hope for the best. Fingers are overrated anyway, right? Now here's a quirky little survival detail. Settlers learned to carry warm stones. They'd heat flat rocks in a fire, wrap them in cloth and tuck them under their arms or into their boots. Travelling women sometimes placed them under their skirts while riding in wagons. Primitive, sure, but effective. Until the stones cooled, which they inevitably did in about 30 minutes. Children were bundled into what could only be described as cloth cocoons, swaddled in layer after layer, often with arms pinned like tiny burritos. This wasn't about mobility. It was about keeping the cold from sneaking in through their sleeves. They waddled, stumbled, and mostly stayed indoors, staring out at the bleak horizon from frosted windows. And that's where we hit another uncomfortable truth. You can do everything right with your outfit, layer like an onion, swaddle like a shepherd, and still end up freezing. Because when it's -40 and the wind's biting through your ribs, clothing becomes less about protection and more about bargaining. It buys you time, not safety. Some trappers developed incredibly precise layering systems. There's this oddball bit of trivia that French-Canadian voyageurs, those fur trade legends, used sashes made of wool to trap heat around the kidneys. They believed keeping the core warm was the key to staying alive. Frontier doctors later debated this, some claiming the head needed covering above all else. Others said keeping feet dry was paramount. Science was a little foggy back then. Most advice was passed around like campfire ghost stories. Still, these layers were often soaked, frozen, then thawed again. They stank, they were heavy, and in some cases, they could kill you. If you got wet and didn't change quickly enough, hypothermia would sneak in silently, disguising itself as sleepiness. Many people simply lay down for a minute in the snow and never got up. One more fun historical fact. The fur trade boom led to a strange style trend. Fringes on everything. Coats, trousers, gloves. While they looked cool, and cowboy cosplay still borrows the look, the fringes served a function. They helped rain and snow slide off more easily, keeping the garment drier and slightly warmer. Fashion meets survival, accidental genius. But here's where it gets extra spicy, the scholarly debate of the day. How much did European settlers learn from indigenous peoples when it came to winterwear? Some argue settlers copied everything from moccasins to layered furs, but wrote none of it down, claiming the ideas as their own. Others say most settlers were stubborn fools who ignored local wisdom and suffered for it. The truth? Probably both. Some listened, most didn't. And history has a pretty sharp memory when it comes to pride versus practicality. Now try walking half a mile in that get-up. You'll sweat, then freeze, then sweat again. You'll move like a quilted scarecrow exhausted from the sheer weight of your survival. But you'll make it. Maybe. And in this world, maybe is about as close to a guarantee as you're going to get. You've bundled yourself in every scrap of warmth you can find, animal pelts, wool layers, a crusty old coat that smells vaguely like wet dog, and now you're stepping into your home for the night. Or maybe cave is a better word. Because in this part of the Wild West, the closest thing to a winterproof structure is a sod house. Yep, dirt. You're basically living inside a glorified grass-covered mud brick. You duck through the low doorway. It's barely 5 feet tall, and you're careful not to knock the lintel loose. The roof might be one serious wind gust away from turning into a pile of kindling and disappointment. Inside, it's surprisingly cosy, in a please don't touch anything or it might collapse kinds of way. The walls are thick, sod bricks stacked high, sometimes with layers of straw or newspaper jammed into the cracks to block drafts. If you squint hard enough, you can still see little root tendrils poking out of the ceiling. Earth is literally hanging over your head. Sod houses, or soddies, became the go-to option for homesteaders settling on the vast treeless plains. You couldn't exactly chop down a forest when the nearest tree was 20 miles away, so you dug, sliced the earth into chunks with spades and spud bars, then stacked them like heavy muddy Legos. The result? Building material that was cheap, plentiful, and had decent insulation. Not great, but enough to keep your water from freezing solid on most nights. Still, let's not romanticize it. These homes were damp. They leaked. Mice and insects lived in the walls, sometimes snakes too. You'd hear scratching in the night and hope it wasn't something with fangs and a grudge. When it rained, or snowed and then melted, you had buckets catching drips in every corner. You learned quickly to keep your bedding dry by sheer force of will and a lot of wishful thinking. Your fire's the heart of the room. Not in a poetic way, it's literally the only source of warmth. It sits in a pit in the middle of the floor, or if you're high-end inside a cast-iron stove. The smoke curls up through a hole in the roof which you lovingly refer to as the chimney, even though it's basically a gap in the mud with some sticks holding back the worst of the weather. If the wind shifts, the smoke blows straight back into the house. You cough through dinner and smell like a campfire for the next 3 days. Speaking of dinner, your cooking setup is minimal. A skillet, a battered pot, maybe a tin coffee can. You cook everything in one container, and the smoke flavours it whether you like it or not. Tonight, it's beans with a hunk of salt pork. Again, always salt pork. It doesn't freeze, spoil, or taste particularly good. But you'll eat it until your dreams smell like brine. Lighting's another battle. Maybe you have a lantern fueled with precious kerosene, or you're still stuck with candles made from tallow, aka animal fat here. They burn fast and low, flickering shadows across the dirt walls. The air inside stays heavy and greasy. You try to avoid breathing too deeply, not just because of the smoke, but because you're sharing this air with 6 other people and a goat. Now here's your quirky, slightly revolting historical fact. Settlers often sealed their homes using a mixture called chinking, a paste made from mud, straw, and sometimes animal dung. Yep, that's right, poo walls. Not ideal for modern sensibilities, but surprisingly effective at plugging cold air leaks. Some folks even claimed the smell added to the ambience. Those folks were either lying or had permanently damaged noses. What about beds? You think you're heading to a cosy mattress with flannel sheets? Try a wooden frame stuffed with dried grass, straw or corn husks. Lumpy, scratchy, occasionally home to things that wriggle. You throw your buffalo robe over the top and call it comfort. One bed might sleep an entire family, pressed together like sardines in a can. It's not just about affection, it's strategic heat conservation. Body heat was the real MVP of frontier life. Now, despite the house being built into the earth and surrounded by snow, you'll be amazed to wake up and find a layer of frost inside the walls, sometimes on your bedding, sometimes on your face. You breathe through a scarf or risk waking up with your nose glued shut. Windows, if you have them, are just holes covered in waxed cloth or greased paper. They let in a ghost of light and a generous helping of wind. And while the sod house had its charms, many settlers tried other shelter strategies that sound even more desperate. Dugouts were literal holes in the side of hills, covered with logs and earth. In some of the flattest regions, where not even a decent hill existed, people buried their shelters partially underground to trap the earth's warmth. It worked, kind of, but moisture was a constant companion. You were never dry, you just learnt to tolerate a permanent layer of dampness in your socks and soul. Here's a hot debate from the historians. Were these sod homes truly superior to log cabins? Some argue yes, they insulated better, especially during bitter prairie winters. Others say the maintenance and health hazards, looking at you, rat infestations, outweighed the benefits. Modern tests with thermal cameras suggest sod might have had the edge, but who's taking thermal images of 1800s dirt piles? Either way, it was what people had, and they made it work. You lie down at the end of the night, curled under every blanket and hide you own. The fire's dying down, crackling softly in the corner. Wind whistles through a crack near the door, and you can hear a coyote howl way off in the hills. It's not peaceful, but it's the best you've got. You shut your eyes and tell yourself, one more night. And when the snow starts falling again at dawn, you don't even bother getting up right away. You're already thinking about the firewood you burned last night, and how little is left for tomorrow. You wake up in the middle of the night, and it takes you a second to realise what's wrong. It's silent. Too silent. The fire's gone out. You reach your hand outside the buffalo robe, and instantly regret it. The cold slaps your skin like an angry ghost. You fumble to relight the fire with your flint and steel, but everything feels clumsy. Your fingers stiff and half numb. Welcome to the reality of relying on fire in the Wild West winter. You never have enough, and it never lasts long enough. Getting a fire started out here isn't as simple as tossing a match on some logs. First of all, matches are scarce, and the ones you do have are finicky. You've probably used up your best ones weeks ago, and now you're down to your emergency stash. Sulphur-tipped nightmares that snap more often than they spark. So you go old school, flint, steel and a tinderbox. Your tinder isn't store-bought. It's whatever will take a spark. Charcloth if you've prepared, or dry grass if you're lucky. You strike the steel, it catches, and you hold your breath. If there's wind, it might blow out before you even start. If your hands are too cold, you'll fumble and waste time. And time is warmth. Time is life. You coax a tiny ember into a flicker of flame, then baby it with twigs until it grows into something you can call fire. When it finally catches, you lean in close, letting it kiss the ice from your cheeks. You learn quickly that not all fires are created equal. In the Wild West, you become something of a campfire engineer. The classic teepee fire burns fast and hot, good for cooking but terrible for conserving fuel. The log cabin style is steadier, with thick logs stacked like Lincoln's dreams. Then there's the Dakota fire hole, which feels downright revolutionary once you've figured it out. You dig 2 holes side by side, one for fire, one for air flow, and cover it carefully. It's smokeless, efficient, and genius for avoiding attention, whether from outlaws or just jealous neighbours. Speaking of fuel, don't even dream of big crackling logs unless you live near trees, and good luck with that on the plains. Out there, your options are limited, and increasingly weird. You burn whatever's available. Sagebrush, twisted scrub oak, fence posts you swore you weren't going to touch. And when that runs out, you move on to cow chips. Yep, dried out discs of livestock poop, and there's an art to it. Cow chips need to be bone dry. If they are still holding moisture, they'll smoulder and stink worse than a burning outhouse. But when fully cured by sun and wind, they burn surprisingly well. Kids would go out on chip-gathering missions, loading up baskets of the stuff like it was treasure. And it kind of was. Out there, dried dung meant warmth, meals, and survival. Here's a quirky truth. Some families got so good at managing their firewood that they had specialised tricks for stretching it. They'd bank their fires at night, piling ash over glowing coals to keep them alive until morning. The next day they'd clear off the ash and coax the embers back into flame without using new tinder. It was part science, part stubbornness, and totally necessary. Because if you had to restart a fire from scratch every morning, you'd run out of fuel and patience before the month was out. Now, let's stir up a little scholarly debate. Some historians argue that settlers were wildly inefficient with their heating methods, especially early on. They burned through resources without much strategy, focused more on getting warm now than on surviving long term. Others say the opposite, that people were extremely resourceful and adapted quickly, especially when they shared techniques with native peoples. Which is it? Hard to say. Diaries are full of both desperation and clever tricks, so maybe it depends on the family, or the weather, or how stubborn Dad was about not burning the barn walls just yet. Either way, you become obsessed with fire. You plan your day around it. You measure your nights by how well it lasted. In milder times, you might even try to cook a real meal. Beans, cornbread, maybe some dried apples soaked in water overnight to soften them up. But during the worst of it, you just melt snow for drinking water and warm up whatever you've got. Ah, snow. That brings us to another brutal truth. Snow is not your friend. It looks peaceful, sure, but it buries everything. It covers wood piles, soaks your firewood, and makes you dig trenches just to reach the outhouse. And yes, the outhouse. You have to trudge out there at night, through waist-deep snow, just to freeze your rear end in the least glamorous way possible. Some folks gave up entirely and used chamber pots, others just held it. Neither option wins awards. A fringe fact? In some areas, settlers built little windbreaks around their fires outside using rocks or snowbanks. The trick was to redirect the airflow to help feed the flame while blocking the worst gusts. You'd think it would be too cold for this kind of outdoor activity, but if you wanted hot food on the trail, you had no choice. Fires became both your kitchen and your therapist. You sat around them, stared into the flickering orange light, and whispered things you couldn't say out loud to anyone. And that brings us to the emotional side of it all. Fire wasn't just heat, it was hope. In a soddy or a tent or a dugout, the fire gave you a centre, a reason to huddle close, a ritual. Without it, the silence got too big, the dark got too deep, and the cold started to whisper your name a little too sweetly. Tonight you manage to keep it going. You bank the coals, stretch out near the warmth, and fall asleep with the soft crackle echoing in your ears. Outside, the wind keeps roaring, but inside, there's light, there's heat, there's a fighting chance. The first thing you notice when you wake up, other than the creeping chill where your blanket slipped off in the night, is that your lips are cracked, your throat is dry, and your breath fogs in the air like you're exhaling ghosts. But you're alive. The fire's down to glowing coals, and you know better than to let it go cold again. You crawl over, still wrapped in layers like some sluggish winter beast, and start nursing the embers back to life. This dance between you and the fire is getting old, but it's still the only relationship that truly matters out here. Once it's going again, you think about the day ahead. You need to leave shelter. You're almost out of water, and snow's no good until it's boiled. You also need meat, which means hunting, or scavenging if you're too snowbound to get far. That means stepping out into the open air, into the cold that bites your skin before you've even finished tying your boots. So you prep for the day's survival dance. But before you go, let's talk about what keeps you warm when the fire can't come with you. Ingenuity, desperation, and centuries-old trail tricks. Out on the frontier, the campfire doesn't always travel with you. Whether you're herding cattle, scouting for game, or just trudging 5 miles to check on a neighbouring homestead, you can't rely on a crackling fire to keep you warm, so you get creative. You build heat from the inside out, or from whatever you can cram into your coat. Let's start with the most underrated Wild West accessory, the hot stone. We touched on it before, but it deserves its spotlight. You heat up a stone near your fire, flat river stones work best, and wrap it in rags or animal hide. Then you shove it into your coat, under your blankets, or even into your boots. The heat lasts hours if you do it right, and it's safer than carrying burning coals around in a tin. Yes, people did that too. In wagons, women would place hot stones beneath thick skirts and woolen blankets during cold rides across the prairie. Imagine strapping a small radiator to your thighs, crude sure, but incredibly effective. Now maybe you're stuck outside miles from shelter, trying to keep warm while keeping watch over cattle or while guarding a freight wagon. That's where you get strategic. Cowboys, those grizzled icons of the West, had their own ways of turning minimal gear into survival systems. They'd sleep with their saddle as a windbreak, use their heavy canvas duster coats like a mobile tent, and always kept matches sealed in wax or stuffed in waterproof pouches sewn inside their hats. Their bedrolls weren't just blankets. They were heat traps, often layered with oilskin to block out the wet and wind. You lie down for the night on the frozen ground with your saddle under your head, your rifle across your chest, and your boots still on. Taking them off could mean waking up unable to get them back on, frozen solid. You wrap your coat tight and hope to dream of warm saloons, and maybe, if you're lucky, someone who knows how to cook something other than beans. Here's a fringe little nugget for you. Some cowboys swore by bear grease as an insulator. Yep, smeared it right on the skin, not just to block wind, but also to trap body heat. It worked kind of like modern petroleum jelly, but far smellier, and let's be honest, way more disturbing. But when it's that or frostbite, suddenly you're not so picky. You lather up and thank the unlucky bear. Some folks carried bricks, yep, literal clay bricks, that they'd heat up and use the same way they use stones. Others insulated their boots with a newspaper or even bark. Old saddle blankets were cut up and wrapped around limbs like primitive thermal bandages. It was less about what the item was and more about what it could become when the mercury plunged. Frontier survival was like a permanent episode of Cold Weather MacGyver. You also learn the importance of body placement. When travelling in a group, people would sleep curled together, back to back, side to side, in what you might call the human burrito formation. Modesty went out the window somewhere around the third frostbite scare. Warmth was warmth, whether it came from a brother, a stranger, or the family mule. Spooning was less romantic, more biological imperative. Now let's circle back to the humble campfire. When you can build one out on the trail, it's not always the roaring bonfire you'd hope for. You learn to build small, strategic fires that conserve fuel and stay hidden from wind and unwanted attention. Some travellers built reflective rock walls behind their fires, bouncing heat back toward them rather than letting it float uselessly into the cold night air. Others dug shallow fire pits and sat close, wrapping blankets around their shoulders and knees like cloaks of survival. And then there's the tea. Everyone had a winter tea. Some mix of herbs, pine needles, or whatever passable plant life they could steep in hot water. Not for taste, but for warmth. Some were brewed from juniper berries or wild mint. Others just added a splash of whiskey and called it health tonic. Was it effective? Maybe not. But holding a warm tin cup in your hands, feeling the steam rise to your face, that alone could reset your will to survive. Now for a heated historical argument. Did the myth of the rugged cowboy downplay how desperately these men relied on their environment, and often on indigenous wisdom, to survive the cold? Some historians think our image of Lone Rangers toughing it out ignores how often they copied, borrowed, or outright stole survival tactics from native tribes. Others argue that while inspiration existed, cowboys adapted things into unique systems of their own. The truth's messy, of course. Cultures collided, and when the snow hit, nobody cared who thought of it first. They just wanted to make it through the night with all their 10 fingers. You hunch closer to your morning fire. The sun's rising, but it's weak, just a pale disk behind a wall of clouds. Everything is frozen solid, including your breath. But you've got your boots, your hot rock, your bear grease, you try not to think about it, and just enough coffee grounds to make something that vaguely resembles a drink. You take a sip. It's awful, but it's warm. You haven't known true humility until you've slept with a goat, or a chicken, or, on the coldest nights, a full-grown pig snoring softly beside you like a hairy furnace. Welcome to the Wild West's version of central heating, livestock as bedmates. There's less frontier luxury and more desperate biological cooperation, and once you've tried it, you never look at a barnyard the same way again. Here's the truth. Animals gave more than just food and labour out here. They gave warmth, dense, living, snorting, manure-smelling warmth. When the wind roared across the plains like a freight train made of knives and your fire had burned down to embers, your last, best line of defence was that bleating, bristly creature in the corner. And so, when temperatures dropped to below freezing, and then kept on dropping, you invited them inside. It wasn't just poor settlers or drifters who did it. Entire homesteads would bring the animals in for the winter, sometimes for weeks at a time. Chickens were usually first. You tuck them into boxes or coops near the fire, not out of affection, but because frozen chickens don't lay eggs. And eggs were currency. They were protein, nutrition, and something warm to hold in your palm in the early morning frost. A single egg could feel like a small miracle. So you kept the hens close, sometimes too close. Ever woken up to a chicken roosting on your leg? No. Count yourself blessed. Then came the goats. Goats were weirdly perfect winter companions, sturdy, curious and warm. They also liked to cuddle, sort of. If you ignored the occasional headbutt and refusal to obey basic personal boundaries, they were solid heat sources. Frontier kids would sometimes curl up with them at night, giggling under blankets while their parents just thanked whatever deity was listening that nobody had frozen solid. Pigs were even warmer if you could get over the smell and the snoring, which sounded like a bellows crossed with a swamp monster. But hey, they radiated heat like radiators and didn't mind being sat on, leaned against, or covered with blankets. On many farms, the pigs slept inside right next to the hearth, while everyone else curled up nearby like satellites orbiting a very smelly star. Then there were the dogs. Always dogs. Half wild, loyal, and as frostbitten as their humans, frontier dogs were more than pets. They were survival buddies. They'd sleep curled around your feet or draped across your chest, and they never complained, not even when snow clung to their fur in icy clumps. Kids especially loved sleeping with the family dog. It was comfort in the most uncomfortable of places. Now this wasn't a nightly ritual just for laughs. This was based on pure thermal logic. Your average chicken generates about 10 watts of heat. A goat? Closer to 70. A pig? Easily 100. Stack that with 3 or 4 human bodies and a half-hearted fire, and suddenly you're turning that sod house into a low-rent sauna. Well, if you ignored the constant threat of stepping in something unpleasant barefoot at 2 a.m, here's a strange but true fringe fact. There are recorded instances of people sharing blankets with their livestock, especially calves. A sickly calf meant lost meat and lost money, so ailing animals were brought into the home and literally nursed under quilts with the family. It wasn't glamorous, but when your survival depended on that cow making it through the winter, you tucked her in right next to the kids. Of course, bringing animals indoors had its own risks, disease for one. Hygiene took a back seat to body heat, but that doesn't mean folks didn't notice the stink, or the fleas, or worse. Horses were almost never brought inside unless it was a matter of absolute emergency, and even then it meant a major rearrangement of living space. You didn't want a 2-ton animal panicking inside a one-room shack, but cattle in the shed just off the main room? That was practically normal. Here's a point of historical debate. Some frontier diaries describe animal sharing as a quirky but rare practice, while others insist it was standard in harsher regions like Montana, Dakota Territory, and the remote parts of Colorado. The truth likely lies in the weather. If it hit below zero and stayed there for weeks, nobody cared what was normal. They cared what was alive by morning. There's another layer to this strange domestic arrangement, psychological comfort. The animals weren't just warm, they were grounding. In the endless silent nights when the wind howled and snow piled up outside the door like the edge of the world, the low sounds of familiar beasts gave people something to focus on, something breathing, something alive, and that mattered. You might laugh now at the thought of a hardened cowboy spooning a goat for warmth, but imagine it's your third night with no firewood, your boots are stiff with frost and your breath keeps catching in your throat. That goat starts looking a lot like a hero in fur. You pull her closer, wrap the blanket tighter, and let the world freeze as long as your patch of it stays just warm enough. And that leads us to one final image. A sod house at midnight, lit by the dull glow of coals, filled with sleeping people and softly breathing animals. It's quiet, except for the occasional cluck, snort or fart from any species. You're not cosy exactly, but you're not dead. And out here, that's a win. You shift under the hide blanket, trying not to disturb the goat who's halfway on your feet. You can feel her steady, warm weight. She smells like hay and barn, and you don't even care anymore. Because in this strange new world of frozen nights and endless wind, survival doesn't look how you thought it would. It looks like a shared blanket, a smelly roommate, and the soft, rhythmic puff of animal breath in the dark. By now, you've accepted that warmth in the Wild West isn't about comfort. It's about cunning. No one's out here sipping cocoa in a rocking chair while the snow gently piles up outside the window. More often, you're huddled behind a boulder, chipping ice out of your moustache with a rusty knife and trying to remember what your toes used to feel like. And if there's any group of people who knew how to wrestle with winter and sort of win, it was the cowboys. Let's get this straight. Cowboys weren't just summer trail riders in dusty hats. They worked all year. and that included brutal winters on the open range, where snowstorms didn't ask permission and the cold made your spit freeze before it hit the ground. Wrangling cattle when the temperature dropped meant long days and even longer nights, often with nothing between you and the elements but a bandana and a lot of misplaced confidence. So how did these guys survive out there? First off, layering. Cowboys weren't dumb, they knew what froze and what didn't. Under everything they wore long johns, wool if they could get it, cotton if they couldn't. Then came canvas trousers or leather chaps, which weren't just fashion statements. They blocked wind, protected against rain, and, as it turns out, made halfway decent insulation when stiff with frost. Over that, wool shirts, heavy vests, maybe a duster coat, long oil-treated canvas that worked like a wearable tarp. It repelled water, blocked wind, and looked pretty epic when it flapped dramatically behind you on horseback. Boots were essential but flawed. Traditional cowboy boots with their pointed toes and smooth soles weren't designed for icy terrain. Riders dealt with this by stuffing socks into boots, wrapping them in sacking or burlap, or even sliding them inside larger Arctic overshoes when they could get them. For those on tighter budgets, i.e. most of them, they wrapped feet in gunny sacks or old saddle blankets. It wasn't comfortable, but you could still ride, still walk, and most importantly, still feel your toes when you finally stopped for the night. Now, the bandana. That's not just for looking cool or robbing trains. In winter, a cowboy would soak it, freeze it stiff, then wrap it around his face. Why? The frozen cloth created a barrier against the wind, and as your breath warmed it up, it created a crude little heating chamber. Was it comfortable? Not even a little. But it worked, sort of. And then there was the bedroll. Oh, the bedroll. A cowboy's sleeping bag before sleeping bags were a thing. It was usually a canvas tarp wrapped around several wool blankets, often treated with oil to repel moisture. At night, you'd find a relatively flat patch of ground, preferably shielded from the wind, and roll yourself up like a particularly unlucky burrito. You kept your boots on, your hat pulled low, and your pistol close because you never knew what the night would bring, frost, coyotes, or worse, rustlers with nothing better to do than freeze you out of your cattle. Here's a weird historical tidbit. Some cowboys tucked heated irons, or even small coals wrapped in cloth into their bedrolls to add heat. This was risky. Too hot and it could burn through your blankets, or you, but with the right touch it created a hotspot of bliss that could last a couple hours. People learned to sleep with one eye open and one hand on the edge of the roll in case of accidental combustion. It was like bedtime roulette. Cowboys didn't always have fires. Sometimes wood was scarce or snow buried everything. In those cases you learned to dig a shallow pit, bury your fire low, and huddle around it with a pot of coffee and 6 other half-frozen men. Or you just didn't bother with fire at all and slept in shifts. One guy walking in circles while the others tried to catch a little shut-eye before frostbite tapped them on the shoulder. One of the more controversial survival tactics among trail crews? Using cattle for warmth. Not eating them, at least not yet, but sleeping beside them.